Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everybody. I was asked to put a paper into this session by Arnie. And, and then the deadline was looming, and I quickly dashed off an abstract. And then I thought no more about it. And then I picked this whole thing up about 2 months ago. I thought, better start looking at this conference and getting these papers ready. And I read my abstract, and I thought, what was I thinking? I know nothing about this field. So I put it down and did a whole bunch of other things, and then about 2 weeks ago I thought, must now write this paper. And started to get into this whole subject, and I found it absolutely fascinating. So I'm not an expert, but and I really hope to be a little bit thought-provoking to try and address this question, how green is green, and the corollary of that, which is how brown is brown. So without any further ado, let's just dive in. So the questions are, well, the aims of the presentation, it's not aimed to take sides or support renewable versus non-renewable. Not getting into that debate at all. And it's not, and I haven't done a complete exhaustive academic examination of all the pros and cons and the life cycle assessment. But the aim of this is really to try and provoke some discussion, to challenge conventional thinking, and obviously to address the conference theme. Do we need a revolution or an evolution in our existing theories of how do we address some of these issues when we're looking at green projects and perhaps the non-renewable energy projects? Are our existing tools and systems adequate to really take into account the full life cycle of impacts and issues? So the question is, and in this day of the Twitter sphere, I don't do any of these things. And one of my reasons I hate things like Twitter is because everything becomes a binary decision. It's either bad, very bad, to use the terms of one of our presidents in this world, or it's good, or very good. And it's this sort of binary discussion that goes on and disappears into social media and everyone becomes for or against, without really taking into consideration the mass of complexity that exists around every argument. There's very few arguments where it's absolutely yes or no. Look at Brexit, for example. Is it acceptable to sort of make this arbitrary binary decision that all green energy projects are good and all non-renewables are bad? So that's the first question. And do we really understand all the impacts and benefits associated with the whole life cycle of each type of energy source? And then lastly, is environmental and social impact assessment an adequate tool to understand the complex life cycles of some of these projects? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take two examples, one from the green energy sector, and look and see and ask that question, how green is green, and then I'm going to take an example from the non-renewable sector and ask really how brown is brown, or is some of it green as well? So there's what we're going to do. So the first example, solar energy, I'm going to look at the upstream environmental and social costs related to photovoltaic solar energy systems. So we're just going to look now and at a typical sort of life cycle assessment of these projects. In all phases, you have inputs of energy, jobs, and land, and it typically goes through a beneficiation, transport, construction, operation, and maintenance, and then from these PV plants into transmission lines, and then the use of the electricity. But we've also got inputs, the raw materials that go into making these panels, and then the transportation of those from all over the world to wherever the panels are made. But within this cycle, you've got a whole range of impacts. There's waste, there's environmental degradation, biodiversity impacts, health impacts, social impacts, air, water emissions, and aesthetics. From each one of these phases, similar, maybe slightly different, but there are a range of impacts associated with each one of these stages. But then, of course, you have the opportunity particularly in the renewable energy sector, that from operation, some of the the used materials, you can then recover quite a lot of metals and materials from those waste components, and it goes through waste cycling and it can come back here. So there is an element within this system of some feedback and reuse of some of the waste components. So it's not all totally lost. But we also sometimes overlook the whole downstream side of the life cycle, which is the use of electricity has numerous benefits to a country and to socioeconomic development of a country, particularly the social, through economic growth, employment, skills development, and so on, as well as just the use of electricity in business and so on, and industry, waste emissions, and so on. So there's quite a complex life cycle that goes on from the upstream. So this is really the cradle to grave at the end of this. And I'm just going to examine really what are we looking at and some of the impacts associated with this. So typically, environmental and social impact assessment of a solar energy project will look at the construction phase, the operation and maintenance, and the transmission lines evacuating the power out of that system. I'm talking the big ones. I'm not talking panels on people's roof. So an ESIA will typically just look at this aspect of the entire life cycle, which is only sort of 3 components. It's not the entire life cycle at all. Whereas typically, reading through the literature, the life cycle assessments that I found mostly focused at this stage. Not really cradle to grave at all. This is really looking to sort of in-gate to out-gate of the manufacturing process and comparing gigawatt hours, global contribution to CO2 and so on within the manufacturing process and possibly its transportation. And only with very limited acknowledgement of the totality of impacts that occur around the raw materials exploitation and transportation of these things. So really what I found was that most studies tend to focus on the greenhouse gas savings and the contribution to global warming, or energy payback time, EBPT, which is another indicator and which people compare this solar panel to this type of solar panel, because there's several generations now as the technology evolves of some of the different energy that these things take to construct and to put together. There are some environmental indicators used in life cycle assessment, for example, the Eco Indicator 99. But my question is, does this adequately account for the loss of biodiversity, especially rare and endangered species? And does it actually take into account some more intangible social costs? What about the questions of aesthetics? Again, more intangibles, visual impact, noise, loss of sense of place. Are any of these aspects really properly accounted for in some of these far more technical types of life cycle assessment? So as I said, most life cycle assessments really look like they're from the in-gate to the out-gate of the manufacturing plant. But I also wonder in these life cycle assessments, what are the key assumptions, because they're not usually explicit, about the mines, the mining methods, and the practices around the mines for obtaining the raw materials. A lot of these are not, most all raw materials, as particularly from mines, are not renewable, obviously, and many are very, very scarce. And can some of these things keep up with demand as well? What about the social health, occupational health and safety, and human rights issues associated with mining? These are most definitely not quantified in any life cycle assessment. And what about the downstream use of electricity and the benefits that this can bring? So, as I say, they're not cradle-to-grave assessments at all, although it calls it life cycle assessment, but I found that this actually was a bit of a misnomer. So just for 1 second, let's consider, these are some of the main components, minerals that go into PV construction and into the storage batteries. Don't forget, this is an equally important part of the whole cycle. And these are just the more common ones. As you can see, there's a whole list of things. Some of these are terms I've been around the mining industry for years, but I've never heard of indium before. I think I have heard of gallium. But some of these I'd never even heard of. There's rare earths and rare minerals. And these are some of the countries' main global sources. And the ones in bold are where the bulk of the production occurs, or where the bulk of the mineral comes from. Now, without casting any aspersions on any of these countries, there are some countries there that probably have, let's say, weaker institutional and regulatory frameworks for ESIA around the mining industry. So they are better or less good at managing the environmental impacts of the mining of some of these products. And don't forget, there's now a huge and rapidly rising demand for some of these. So there's a bit of a rush for some of, and how are the cumulative effects being addressed as well? So these are some of the questions one needs to ask. So are we confident that environmental and social safeguards are in place at all the countries where these minerals are mined? And just flicking through, this is some of the awful, awful conditions of child labor in the DRC, in the cobalt mines. This is river mining in China. This is in Guinea, bauxite mining. This is also, I think, in DRC. This is in Gabon, and so on. And this is in Peru. Look at the urban area around this big pit. And the question then, obviously, is, or has been posed by the Institute of Sustainable Futures report, which came out on the 17th of April, that going 100% renewable power means a lot of dirty mining. And I think this is the question we really need to ask ourselves, is how green is green? The second example I'd like to go through, 5 minutes, is looking at natural gas and the downstream socioeconomic benefits. So this is the question, how brown is brown, or is there something green about the brown? I'm going to look at, just taking as a case study, the Rovuma Basin off the northern coast of Mozambique in southern Africa. Here's Mozambique and the border with Tanzania here, but the offshore basin is sitting in here. Unfortunately, this area has just been hit by a terrible cyclone, so maybe some of these things I'm going to say about foreign direct investment perhaps have just been literally blown and washed away. But I did this before the cyclone. But anyway, they found this vast gas reserve in the Rovuma Basin, estimated 2.8 to 3 trillion cubic meters. And at peak production, this could make Mozambique the third largest producer or exporter of LNG in the world. So, this is in a country of Mozambique, which is in a chronic state of underdevelopment. 65% of the population lives in extreme poverty. People don't have access to clean water or sanitation or electricity. Very low levels of education attainment, high burdens of communicable and non-communicable diseases, high rates of malnutrition, etc., etc. So you get the picture. It's a very, very poor country, particularly up in the far north. But in spite of this, Mozambique has had a sustained average annual GDP growth of about 7% for the last quite a few years, and they're predicting this is going to continue on for many more years. Now, this is way in excess of the surrounding countries, the rate of growth, and it's because of natural gas and oil that has been found in Mozambique. So, in this area of in the north, around the Rovuma Basin, and these are all figures from fairly detailed analysis, that the foreign direct investment increased by 58% in the 2 years following the gas discovery. It attracted $9 million in 2014 alone. And it created about 84% of the 1 million jobs that were created by foreign direct investment in that period were attributed to the discovery of gas. And they also calculated that for every one FDI, foreign direct investment job created, an extra 6 would be created in either the same or associated sectors. And then a lot of these jobs were created in the informal sector, and 65% by women. So, and most of these FDI jobs tended to have higher salary rates. This is enormous. In a country of extreme poverty, these are incredible benefits. So it's led to investment in many, many different sectors, diversification of the economy, skills development, and so on. But the scale of the sustainable economic growth and diversification depends on many ifs: government stability, governance, investment policies, and so on. And another analysis I looked at on this whole project was that the long-term potential by 2040 was enormous for the country if, a big if, the investment and the returns and the revenues from this gas deposit were properly invested in the country, that it could improve healthcare, sanitation, access to electricity, education, and so on. And there's enormous spin-offs if the revenues from this gas are wisely used. So, in conclusion, we can't take this binary good-bad view of energy, I don't think. I think it misses the whole complexity of the issues involved in upstream and downstream impacts, both positive and negative. And I don't think that environmental and social impact assessment nor traditional life cycle assessments adequately address the entire scope of impacts associated from the cradle, literally from the cradle to the grave. So do we need to revolutionize our approach, is the question. And I do believe there's a greater need for strategic environmental assessment, particularly in areas which are seeing these natural resources and mining booms, because I don't think individual EIAs can really take account of the totality of the impacts of these things, particularly in some of the more underdeveloped countries. To really look at the unintended consequences of this rapacious development which is happening because of the demand. And there's a significant shift in the whole energy supply paradigm, which will need us to focus on quite different things: more responsible procurement, more governance right down at all levels of the supply chain, improved governance to ensure that the energy revenues are actually contributing to sustainable development, and more inclusive environmental and social impact assessments. Thank you very much.